I declare upfront that I never make this video defending Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No aspect of the war could ever be justified. Contemporary international society criticized Russia for the escalating Russian invasion of Ukraine and supported Ukraine, especially after impartial nations like Sweden and Finland declared their desire to join Nato. There is a growing anti-Russian feeling. Russia claimed that historically both Russia and Ukraine had been one nation, so they are unable to acknowledge the Ukraine attempt to become an independent sovereign state. Additionally, Russia used the liberation of Ukrainians from Nazism and anti-Russian influence in Ukraine as justification for the conflict. The Ukraine war has several causes, but Ukraine's attempt to join NATO is by far the most important one. In actuality, Russia has been anxious about NATO expansion. For a very long time, the former Soviet Union's nations broke away from Russian influence. Consequently, we may understand what the Russian perspective is on NATO expansion. In the early 20th century, when socialism was a topic of intense debate around the globe, capitalist and imperialist nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, and France were opposed to the spread of socialism. In this instance, 1917 saw the start of the Russian Revolution. On this day, the world's first socialist nation was founded. Russia has been alone and wasn't welcomed into socialism by any nations. In particular, the Soviet Union was made to feel uneasy by the intervention of the UK, France, the US, China, and Japan in the Russia Civil War to overthrow the country's socialist government. This was done to show the world that capitalist nations could overthrow Russia at any time. In order to temporarily defeat Hitler, the Soviet Union and the United States, who had been at odds on a number of issues, temporarily put their dispute on pause. While the Soviet Union was petrified that democracy would be established in the buffer zone surrounding it and that the United States would seize control of security in Eastern Europe, the United States feared that the Soviet Union would increase its influence in Eastern Europe. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president at the time, convinced the Soviet Union to acknowledge its influence in Eastern Europe. In exchange for protecting the buffer zone along the border and preventing an anti-Soviet dictatorship in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union took part in World War II. However, the social climate shifted following World War II and Truman's administration. Truman ordered the NATO to stop the socialist wave from spreading and to reduce Soviet influence in the socialist core. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an international military alliance that serves as the main axis of defense for the United States and Western Europe against the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe socialism. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States also assisted Western Europe's economies, with the exception of Russia, which was severely battered during World War II. In reality, the USSR suffered the greatest loss, including the greatest number of deaths during World War II. Additionally, Germany's defeat in the war was sealed by the USSR's victory against it. But following World War II and the start of the Cold War era, repressing socialism took precedence over Nazism. Thus, the idea that the USSR played a role in World War II was losing steam. All that is left is the fact that the USSR is a socialist nation. Stalin was aware of the USSR's isolation from the rest of the world. In addition, the Soviet Union attempted to build diplomatic ties with Western capitalist nations and participated in world affairs because it was much more economically and militarily weaker than the United States. However, no nation supported Stalin. Stalin attempted to join NATO, but the US turned him down. What the Marshall Plan was implemented in this situation resulted the USSR was certain that Truman's administration, as opposed to Roosevelt, would intervene in Eastern Europe. NATO and the EU began to assertively enlarge their influence across Russia's border after the fall of the Soviet Union. As they continued to grow, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia joined NATO. Additionally, NATO's reach was significantly expanded during Bill Clinton's presidency. Actually, with the Soviet Union, Western nations made a vow not to encroach on Eastern Europe. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, a former foreign minister of Western Germany, stated that change in Eastern Europe and German unification must not have harmful implications toward the Soviet Union's security interests. Additionally, Gorbachev was informed by James Baker, a former U.S. Secretary of State, that NATO will not extend into Eastern Europe not 1 inch eastward, and he included the president's perspective while keeping his own. Gorbachev agreed that United Germany would stay in NATO because he thought the talks would prevent NATO from expanding eastward. It might be inferred that Russia, who had feared the growth of Germany ever since they had to fight in World War II, allowed a united Germany to join NATO. The implication was that Russia made a lot of concessions. The United States, however, continued to insist it never made this pledge. NATO was not dissolved, even though the Warsaw Pact was. Many Russians criticized the Warsaw Pact for being paradoxical in that NATO, which was designed to target the Soviet Union during the Cold War, is still in existence today. Even Boris Yeltsin's application to join NATO was turned down. Why did the United States reject Russia's application to join NATO if NATO was not genuinely intended to counter the Soviet Union? Ukraine declared they wanted to join NATO, which sparked the Ukraine War. If the US had control over Ukraine, it would be easier for it to obtain abundant natural resources in Central Asia and restrain Russia. However, Russia should take a stand against NATO forces invading the country about 700 kilometers from Moscow, the capital. This essentially indicated that NATO's short-range ballistic missiles can reach key Russian cities. The Cuban Missile Crisis comes to mind. In my opinion, the Ukraine War should be resolved similarly to how Kennedy and Khrushchev handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. Specifically, the Soviet Union and Russia have been wary of NATO expansion. Overall, it is difficult to blame just NATO for this war. We cannot, however, deny that this war is a continuation of Russia's previous phobia of the buffer zone. What stance will the Soviet Union found Lenin take on the ongoing invasion of Ukraine? Any nation and any rank ought to gain from privilege, according to Lenin. The issue of the people's right to self-determination can be resolved by granting them the freedom to create an independent democratic state. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has seen significant prejudice and repression. In this case, Lenin argued that there should be no prejudice toward Ukraine and the Russians and Ukrainians should be treated equally. Imperialism, according to Lenin, is the pinnacle of capitalism. This power struggle between the United States and Russia is an imperialist conflict. Lenin was vehemently against it. Lenin probably despised the conflict that Putin started. Lenin was aiming for a communist society, but Putin is now on a totally different route. I believe it is time for all of us to reconsider the best course for the entire world. I genuinely hope that the conflict in Ukraine will soon come to an end. So thank you for watching this video and please don't forget to click the subscribe and the like button.